In the vast Pacific, an ocean so beautiful it seemed eternal, war had turned its waters red. By early 1945, this boundless sea had become the greatest killing field in human history. And upon it lay a small volcanic island, barely 8 square miles of black sand and sulfur, called Iwo Jima. Its name meant Sulphur Island, but its meaning would soon be written in blood. From afar, Iwo Jima rose from the ocean like a wound, raw, smoking, defiant. Its black sands, forged by centuries of volcanic fury, burned beneath the feet of men. Beneath its jagged ridges, Japanese engineers had carved a fortress into the earth, tunnels, bunkers, and pillboxes linked by 11 miles of underground passageways. The island was not merely defended, it had been weaponized. For Japan, Iwo Jima was sacred ground, a final line shielding the homeland just 750 miles from Tokyo. For America, it was a stepping stone, a place to land crippled B-29s and stage the bombing of Japan itself. The two visions could not coexist. The invasion fleet gathered, 3 full Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 70,000 men in all. They were the heirs of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, veterans of hell's apprenticeship. But even they could not imagine what awaited them on this black rock. Their enemy, General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, had abandoned the traditional banzai charge for something far more sinister, a defense built on patience, attrition, and death from below. He had sworn that every American who stepped onto the island would pay dearly for every yard of ground. On the troopships, as naval guns pounded the horizon, Marines checked their gear in silence. Rifles, bayonets, letters home. They smoked, joked, prayed. Some gazed across the waves toward the faint silhouette of the island, realizing they were staring at the place where their lives might end. They were farm boys, factory workers, and college kids, ordinary men bound by the unspoken covenant of the Corps. The fear they carried was not of death, but of failing one another. Then came L-Day, February 19, 1945. At dawn, the bombardment ceased. Smoke drifted. The ocean fell eerily silent. Landing craft began to churn toward shore, toward the ash and the abyss. When the first boots hit the black sand, it felt like stepping onto a furnace. The beach offered no cover, only open ground under the shadow of Mount Suribachi, a volcanic peak crowned with hidden guns. The Marines advanced, and the island erupted. Hidden machine guns burst from invisible slits. Mortars howled from unseen pits. The sand itself seemed alive with fire. The men were caught in a storm of metal and flame, where every inch of progress was bought with blood. Smoke blanketed the horizon. Corpsmen crawled through the sand to reach the wounded. Bulldozers carved paths through bodies and wreckage. Every foot of ground seemed to scream. Amid this inferno moved a young Marine runner named René Gagnon, a messenger carrying words through chaos. He was one of thousands, unknown and unremarkable. Yet fate had chosen him for something that would outlive the war itself. As day bled into night, the Marines clawed upward toward Mount Suribachi. The Japanese refused to surrender, fighting from the tunnels, the shadows, the very bones of the earth. The men began to understand, this was no ordinary island. It was a tomb, and they were fighting inside it. The air reeked of sulfur and gunpowder. Men called it hell with the lid off. And atop that mountain, still wreathed in smoke, stood their single goal, to raise the American flag where the world could see it. It was not yet a moment of triumph, only a desperate spark of hope in a world of ash. The story of that flag, and the Marines who lifted it from ruin, would soon transcend the battlefield. It would become a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will of those who fought on the island of fire and ash. The assault began under an eerie silence. After 3 days of thunderous bombardment, the guns finally stopped, leaving behind a smoking, broken shore. The Marines waited, hearts pounding, as their landing craft churned through the waves toward the black sands of Iwo Jima. Then came the stillness. No gunfire. No movement. only the hiss of surf and the low rumble of engines. Some dared to believe the bombardment had done its job. It had not. General Tadamaki Kurabayashi's plan was brilliant in its cruelty. He had ordered his men to hold their fire until the beaches were thick with Marines, vehicles, and supplies. When the signal came, the island erupted. From the slopes of Mount Suribachi, mortars screamed from hidden caves. Artillery shells, pre-sighted months in advance, slammed into the landing zones. The black sand swallowed boots and blood alike, soft, shifting, impossible to dig into. The beaches became killing grounds. Men fell in clusters. Wounded Marines crawled toward the water, only to be dragged back by the tide or caught again in the storm of steel. It was a harvest of youth, methodical, merciless, and unending. The geography itself seemed to conspire against them. Every ridge, every crater concealed another gun. And yet, amid that chaos, the Marines advanced. Flamethrowers seared pillboxes. Demolition teams clawed through rock and ruin. Every foot forward cost lives, but still they moved, bound by something deeper than orders, the refusal to leave their brothers behind. Among them were men who would one day be bound together by history, the men behind the flag. There was Ira Hayes, a quiet Pima Native American from Arizona, raised in the dust of a reservation where dreams were scarce but pride ran deep. For Ira, the Marine Corps offered belonging, purpose, and equality, ideals the war would test in ways he could never foresee. Beside him, Renee Gagnon, the disciplined runner from New Hampshire, carried messages through hell itself, small slips of paper that meant life or death. He was practical, careful, not a natural warrior, but a man of resolve who did what had to be done. And Harlan Block, a Texas farm boy and former athlete, whose quiet confidence inspired his squad. He fought with the steady faith of one who believed in duty, in comradeship, and in the Marine Brotherhood. They were not heroes of legend. They were sons, brothers, friends, most of them barely 20 years old. Their courage was not born of glory but of necessity, the simple instinct to survive and protect one another in a world that had lost all reason. By late February, after days of blood and smoke, the Marines had clawed their way across the southern end of the island. Mount Suribachi, the dark cone that had poured fire upon them since the landing, was finally within reach. The air reeked of cordite and death, but for the first time, the mountain guns began to fall silent. On the morning of February 23, 1945, a small patrol was ordered to climb Suribachi and secure it. Lieutenant Harold Schreier led the mission. Among his men were Hayes, Gagnon, and Block. Their tasks seemed simple: raise a flag to signal victory. The flag they carried was small, just large enough to be seen from the beaches below, a message of hope to the men still fighting amid the black sand. They climbed slowly, slipping on loose ash, hearts pounding, rifles heavy. When they reached the summit, they found a length of pipe among the wreckage. They fixed the flag to it, lifted it into the wind, and the island erupted again, this time with cheers. Marines below shouted. Ships blared their horns. Tear-streaked faces blackened by smoke and sand. For a brief moment, amid the ruin, there was triumph. But the story was not done. The battalion commander wanted the flag as a souvenir, and another, larger, one raised in its place. When the second flag went up that afternoon, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the instant 6 Marines, Hayes, Gagnon, Block, and 3 others, struggled together to plant it against the wind. They did not pose. They did not plan. It was instinct, pure, exhausted unity. In that split second, the war's horror crystallized into a single image of hope. They could not know that Rosenthal's photograph would soon circle the globe, transforming them into reluctant symbols of a nation's endurance. For the world, it became a monument to courage and sacrifice. For the men themselves, it was simply another duty, another day in the endless grind of war. They had not sought immortality, but in that moment, frozen against the ash-gray sky, they became part of it. For 3 days, The Marines clawed their way up the black sands of Iwo Jima. The beachhead was won only by inches, each foot of ground paid for in blood. But looming above them, like a dark sentinel, stood Mount Suribachi, the volcano whose guns had poured death onto the shore since the first landing. To take Iwo Jima, they first had to take the mountain. The assault on Suribachi was a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Every ridge, every cave, every twisted slope hid a machine gun or mortar nest. The Marines advanced behind flamethrowers and satchel charges, fighting yard by yard through bunkers carved into the rock itself. The air stank of sulfur and cordite. The ground trembled beneath their boots. They fought not for strategy, not even for glory, but for survival, and for the man beside them. The psychological weight was crushing. Suribachi towered above them, its peak wreathed in smoke, its tunnels alive with unseen enemies. To look up at it was to stare into the heart of the impossible. But Marines do not measure the impossible, they simply advance. By the morning of February 23, 1945, after 4 days of unrelenting attrition, the forward elements of the 28th Regiment of the 5th Marine Division reached the volcano's base. Colonel Chandler Johnson knew that if his men could seize the summit, the enemy's will to fight might finally crack. So, at 8 a.m., he ordered a patrol to ascend. 40 men under 1st Lieutenant Harold G. Schreier began the climb. Among them were Ira Hayes, René Gagnon, and Harlan Bloch, names that would soon transcend the battlefield. Their orders were simple: reach the top, secure the crater, and raise the American flag. The flag itself was modest, a small banner taken from the USS Missoula, but its purpose was enormous. It would signal to the men below that the mountain, at last, was theirs. The ascent was slow and perilous. Loose ash slid beneath their boots. Every shadow could conceal an ambush. They moved upward in silence, rifles ready, hearts steady. They were not climbing for history. They were climbing to stay alive. At 10:20 a.m., they reached the summit. There, amid rubble and smoke, they found a length of pipe and fixed the flag to it. When the stars and stripes caught the wind, it was as if the island itself exhaled. From the beaches below came a roar, cheers, shouts, tears. Naval ships sounded their horns. For a brief, fragile moment, amid the ruin, there was triumph. But the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. Even as Marines celebrated, Japanese artillery continued to pound the lower slopes. Colonel Johnson, wanting to preserve the first flag as a keepsake, ordered a second, larger flag to be raised so all could see it. It was during this second raising that history froze in time. Standing nearby was Joe Rosenthal, a photographer with the Associated Press. As 6 Marines, Hayes, Gagnon, Bloch, and 3 others, heaved together to plant the replacement flag, Rosenthal lifted his camera and pressed the shutter. The click lasted less than a heartbeat. Yet that heartbeat would echo through generations. The image he captured was pure motion. No faces, no poses, just unity against the wind. A brief act of duty that became an eternal symbol. When Rosenthal's film reached the Associated Press office in Guam, editors knew instantly what they held. Within hours, the photograph appeared on front pages around the world. To a weary America, it was more than victory, it was hope. Families who had endured years of casualty lists saw, for the first time, a vision of triumph. Churches displayed the image, schools studied it, even mothers who had lost sons whispered prayers beneath it. The government seized upon its power, using it to drive the 7th War Loan Campaign, the largest in U.S. history. But for the men in the picture, the triumph was bittersweet. 3, Harlan Bloch, Michael Strank, and Franklin Sousley were already dead, killed before the island was secured. The surviving 3, Ira Hayes, René Gagnon, and John Bradley, were pulled from the front lines and paraded as heroes. They stood before cheering crowds, haunted by the faces of those left behind. Even worse, confusion over who had truly raised the flag would shadow them for decades. The world saw a symbol. They saw ghosts. Rosenthal's photograph won the Pulitzer Prize and became the most reproduced image of World War II. It transcended journalism, becoming art, myth, and memory. It told a story deeper than victory, a story of endurance, unity, and the unspoken cost of freedom. The flag on Suribachi became a nation's heartbeat, fluttering through the smoke of war into the collective soul of a generation. And though the world saw a flag raised high, the men who raised it saw only the faces they had lost. The climb to the summit of Mount Suribachi on the morning of February 23, 1945, was not a charge, it was a crawl through the heart of hell. Lieutenant Harold Schreier's patrol, 40 men from the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, moved with quiet, deliberate precision through rock, smoke, and sulfur. Each step upward could be their last. They expected fierce resistance at the crater's rim, yet the mountain was eerily silent, as if the volcano itself held its breath. At 10:15 a.m., they reached the top. The crater stretched before them, vast and lifeless, the air thick with the scent of burned earth. In that strange stillness, among shattered stone and wreckage, the Marines unfurled a small American flag, barely 54 by 28 inches, taken from the USS Missoula. They fixed it to a length of steel pipe found among the ruins, working quickly under the watchful eyes of their comrades below. Corporal Harlan Block and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, joined by others in the patrol, lifted the makeshift staff upright. At 10:30 a.m., the first American flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi. Below, the reaction was instantaneous. From the beaches came an eruption of cheers, gunfire, and tears. Thousands of Marines, exhausted and bloodied, saw the flag fluttering in the wind and felt, for the first time, that the mountain, and perhaps the war itself, could be won. Ships offshore sounded their horns, a thunderous salute echoing across the Pacific. General Holland Smith, watching from his command ship, turned to his staff and said, "That flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." But triumph was short-lived. The flag's rise enraged the Japanese defenders hidden deep within the mountain. Moments later, grenades and rifle fire burst from nearby caves, forcing the Marines on the summit into a desperate fight for their lives. The first flag had become both a beacon and a target. Hours later, at Colonel Chandler Johnson's request, a second, larger flag would replace it, the one immortalized by Joe Rosenthal's lens. Yet while the photograph went home, the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. Across the island, the fight raged on with unrelenting ferocity. General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, commanding the Japanese forces, had prepared his defenses for a battle of annihilation, not survival. He forbade wasteful banzai charges. His men would fight from the shadows, from tunnels and caves, to bleed the Americans dry. He knew Japan could not win, but he could make victory unbearable. The Marines advanced yard by yard. The black volcanic sand turned to mud beneath the rain of shells. Flamethrowers roared into bunkers. Grenades echoed through tunnels. Every step forward was paid for in blood. For 36 days, Iwo Jima was a vision of hell. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, more than in any other battle of the Pacific. Of Japan's 21,000 defenders, almost none survived. When the island was declared secure on March 26, 1945, victory felt hollow. The ground was scorched, the air heavy with the stench of death. The living looked around and wondered what winning even meant. The survivors carried Iwo Jima with them for the rest of their lives. They remembered the screams in the night, the silence after the blasts, the faces of friends who vanished into smoke. They remembered the weight of that flag, the symbol the world adored, and the truth it could never show. Back home, the flag raisers, John Bradley, Renee Gagnon, and Ira Hayes, were celebrated as national heroes. But each bore invisible wounds. Bradley, the Navy corpsman, had cradled dying Marines in his arms. He rarely spoke of Iwo Jima again. When called a hero, he simply said, "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." Renee Gagnon, once a quiet messenger, now stood before crowds, repeating speeches written for him by others. Fame felt like betrayal. He smiled for the cameras, but inside he was lost among ghosts. And Ira Hayes, the proud Pima Marine, returned home to a world that cheered him but never understood him. He found no peace in parades, no comfort in applause. The silence of the reservation was louder than any battlefield. For these men, the Battle of Iwo Jima never truly ended. It followed them in nightmares, in memories, in the uneasy quiet of civilian life. The flag they raised became immortal. They, meanwhile, were left to live beneath its shadow, burdened by history, haunted by loss. Because behind every photograph of victory lies a truth of suffering. And behind every flag raised in triumph lies the silence of the fallen. When the first flag rose above Mount Suribachi, it became a promise, proof that victory was possible. But for Colonel Chandler Johnson, commander of the 28th Marines, it was not enough. The flag, though inspiring, was small, barely visible from the beaches where the fiercest fighting still raged. He wanted a larger banner, one that would proclaim beyond doubt that Suribachi was in American hands. His order was simple, almost routine: send a bigger flag up. That command, born of practicality, would create one of the most enduring images in human history. A larger flag, measuring 96 by 56 inches, was found aboard the landing ship LST-779. The task of carrying it up the mountain fell to Private First Class René Gagnon, a runner for the 2nd Battalion. As he began the steep, ash-covered climb, a few combat photographers followed, drawn by a sense that history was about to unfold. Among them was Joe Rosenthal, a civilian photographer for the Associated Press. He was joined by Marine photographers Sergeant Bill Janost and Private First Class Bob Campbell. When they reached the summit, they found a scene of exhaustion and quiet resolve. The first flag still fluttered in the wind. Now, 6 Marines, Harlan Block, Franklin Sousley, Michael Strank, René Gagnon, Ira Hayes, and Harold Schultz, prepared to raise the larger replacement. They were not posing. They were fighting fatigue, balancing on jagged rock, trying to anchor a heavy pipe into the volcanic soil. Rosenthal, seeing the movement, lifted his bulky speed graphic camera and pressed the shutter. The click lasted less than a heartbeat. But in that fraction of a second, he captured something far greater than the moment itself. 6 men, united in motion, straining together to raise the stars and stripes amid ruin and smoke, their faces unseen, their identities unknown. The photograph was pure, unposed, unplanned, and unrepeatable. It was not about individuals. It was about the act itself, the shared struggle, the endurance of the human spirit in the face of annihilation. Rosenthal packed his camera, unsure if he had captured anything of value. The Marines on the peak quickly returned to their positions. The war below raged on. But when that photograph reached the Associated Press, editors stared in silence. They knew instantly what it was. Within hours, the image spread across newspapers worldwide. To a weary America, it was revelation, a moment of light amid the darkest war in history. Families wept. Cities celebrated. The flag raising on Iwo Jima became the symbol of victory itself. The government recognized its power. The image became the face of the 7th War Loan Drive, one of the largest fundraising campaigns in U.S. history. Billions were raised in bonds. The war effort surged anew. And then came the next order: find the men in the picture. 3 of them, Strank, Sousley, and Block, were already dead, killed in the continuing battle for Iwo Jima. The remaining 3, Ira Hayes, René Gagnon, and John Bradley, were pulled from the front lines and sent home as living symbols of victory. When they returned to America, the silence of the battlefield was replaced by the roar of celebration. Bands played. Parades filled the streets. Their faces were printed on posters, stamps, and billboards. They were hailed as heroes, immortalized by a photograph that had already become legend. But beneath the applause, each man carried an invisible weight, the knowledge that the image the world worshipped was not the full truth. René Gagnon, once a humble messenger, now stood before flashing cameras, delivering speeches written for him by officials. He smiled, saluted, and spoke of courage, yet each word felt foreign. He knew the cheers were not for him, but for what he represented, an ideal of victory purified of pain. John Bradley, the Navy corpsman, avoided the spotlight. He had seen too much. He had held dying men in his arms. To him, the flag was not triumph, it was memory. "People call me a hero," he said quietly, "but the heroes are the ones who didn't come back." And Ira Hayes, the quiet Pima Marine from Arizona, returned to a country that celebrated him in parades yet denied him a seat in its restaurants. They called him a hero, but refused him equality. Haunted by the war, alienated by fame, Ira turned inward, seeking solace in silence, and later in the bottle. Reporters called him the Indian who raised the flag. He told them, "How could I feel like a hero when the real heroes are still on Iwo Jima?" The war bond drive that carried them across the nation united Americans? Yes, but it also commodified their suffering. Their image became propaganda, their grief became a symbol. Each man, in his own way, was lost beneath the legend. René struggled to find work after the war. His fame faded faster than his memories. John returned to his small-town life as a funeral director, burying others while never burying the past. Ira drifted across the country, restless and haunted, until his story ended in 1955, dead at 32, alone in an empty field, clutching the soil his ancestors once farmed. They had been lifted up as heroes, yet lived and died as men burdened by their own myth. The photograph had given America something to believe in, but it had taken something from them in return. In time, their faces faded into bronze and textbooks. The image endured, larger than life, carved in stone at Arlington. But the truth remained quiet, that behind every symbol of victory lies the ache of loss. True heroism does not live in applause or monuments. It lives in those who carry the weight of memory and never set it down. The photograph of the flag raising on Iwo Jima flashed across the world within 24 hours. Transmitted by radio photo, it appeared on front pages from New York to London, a single, unforgettable image that seemed to define the very soul of victory. 6 men, caught in motion, straining together to raise the stars and stripes atop Mount Suribachi. It was not staged, not planned, just a fleeting act of war frozen forever in time. For a nation exhausted by years of bloodshed, the image was electric. It was triumph made visible, unity, sacrifice, and resolve embodied in a single frame. But as with all symbols, its truth was far more complex. In the chaos of battle, no one on that mountain recorded the names of the flag raisers. Joe Rosenthal, the Associated Press photographer who took the picture, had simply captured what he saw, 6 anonymous figures against a sky filled with smoke. When the photo reached Washington, the Marine Corps scrambled to identify the men. What followed would be decades of confusion, misidentification, and painful revelation. The 6 figures were soon named: Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Pharmacist's Mate Second Class John Bradley, Private First Class René Gagnon, and Corporal Ira Hayes. 3 of them, Strank, Block, and Sousley, were already dead before the photo hit the newspapers. The image that had inspired millions had also captured men who would never come home. The 3 survivors, Gagnon, Hayes, and Bradley, were pulled from the battlefield and thrust into a different kind of war. They became the faces of the 7th War Bond Drive, paraded across the country, smiling before cameras, repeating speeches written by others. They were symbols now, no longer soldiers but myths. Yet even amid the celebrations, doubt lingered. When Ira Hayes returned home and saw the official identifications, something inside him twisted. One of the men listed wasn't who they said he was. Hayes knew he had been there. It was Harlan Block, his friend, who had stood beside him on the mountain, not the man the Corps had named. He tried to tell the truth. He wrote letters, spoke to officers, even visited the family of the wrongly credited Marine. No one wanted to listen. The photograph had already been printed on posters and postage stamps. The lie was convenient. The truth was not. Finally, unable to bear the silence, Ira traveled to Texas to meet Harlan Block's mother. Standing on her doorstep, he told her the truth. "Ma'am, your son was one of the flag raisers." His words reopened an investigation, and the error was eventually corrected. But for Ira, the victory was hollow. He had seen how history could be rewritten, even in the name of heroism. Years turned into decades. Historians, photographers, and analysts continued to study the image, comparing frames, helmets, equipment, and shadows. Each discovery brought new corrections. As recently as 2019, the Marine Corps once again revised its official list of names. The photograph that had once stood as the ultimate symbol of clarity, of certainty, proved to be imperfect. But in that imperfection lay its humanity, because the power of Joe Rosenthal's photograph was never in the names. It was in what it represented, the collective struggle of thousands of Marines who fought, bled, and died for a patch of volcanic rock in the Pacific. The faces may have blurred, the records may have changed, but the meaning endured. Unity, sacrifice, the anonymous strength of those who gave everything without asking for recognition. For the families of the misnamed, the corrections mattered deeply. They were not chasing glory, they were chasing truth, the small comfort of knowing exactly where their sons had stood in history. Each new revelation reopened old wounds, a reminder that even legends have fractures. In the end, the flag on Suribachi came to represent them all, the known and the unknown, the named and the forgotten. The truth behind the photograph was not about perfection. It was about humanity, flawed, selfless, and eternal. Because behind that immortal image were 6 men. Behind those 6 men were thousands. And behind them all, the silent, endless shadow of sacrifice. When the guns fell silent and the last flag rippled in the sulfur wind, Iwo Jima remained, a black scar in the middle of the Pacific. The waves still broke against its volcanic shores, and the sand still whispered the names of the men who never left. For both America and Japan, it became sacred ground, an island of ghosts. Beneath its hardened surface lay the bones of more than 26,000 soldiers. Some were buried with ceremony. Others were entombed forever in the tunnels they had fought to hold or to take. The battle had ended, but Iwo Jima had become a tomb. For Japan, it was hallowed soil, Chichijima no Ototo, the younger brother of the homeland. Families came to pray, leaving offerings for sons and fathers whose spirits, they believed, still stood guard. They remembered General Tadamaki Kuribayashi not as a fanatic, but as a man of honor, a commander who fought without illusions. In his final letter home, he wrote, "Do not expect my return. This is my destiny." For America, the island's name became legend, a single word synonymous with courage and sacrifice. And the photograph taken on its peak became the face of that legend, 6 men straining together to raise a flag in hell. But behind that image lay a hidden struggle, one that followed its survivors home. When the surviving flag raisers, Ira Hayes, Renee Gagnon, and John Bradley, returned to the United States, they were met not by gunfire, but by adoration. Bands played. Parades roared. They were hailed as heroes, the living symbols of victory. But the truth behind that image was already beginning to crack. During the hasty identification process, confusion and exhaustion led to mistakes. Renee Gagnon, under immense pressure, named one man incorrectly. The Marine Corps, desperate to capitalize on the photo's power, accepted the identifications without question. Among those misnamed was Harlan Block, a quiet, fearless Marine who had died only days after the flag was raised. His name was missing from history. Only one man noticed the lie, Corporal Ira Hayes. He had stood beside Harlan on Suribachi. He had watched him die. And now he watched the wrong names etched into the record. The guilt consumed him. During the Bond tour, while the nation celebrated, Ira stood in silence, his eyes distant. The applause felt hollow. The speeches, meaningless. He could not escape the thought that his friend's name had been forgotten, erased by convenience and pride. Haunted, Ira made a decision. In 1946, he traveled nearly 1,300 miles, from his home on the Gila River Reservation to Texas, to meet Harlan Block's mother. Standing before her, exhausted and trembling, he said the words no one else had dared to speak. "Ma'am, your son was one of the flag raisers." His confession sparked an investigation. For months, the Marine Corps resisted, unwilling to reopen wounds or rewrite their legend. But truth has a way of resurfacing. In January 1947, the Corps finally admitted its error. The record was corrected. Harlan Block had indeed been one of the 6 men in Rosenthal's immortal photograph. It was a victory for truth, but it came at a terrible cost. The burden Ira had carried broke him. The man America had once celebrated now wandered in silence, drowning his pain in drink, hunted by reporters, haunted by ghosts. He died in 1955, at the age of 32, alone, in a field, face down in the mud. Beside him lay the same soil his ancestors had farmed, and the same memory he could never escape. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Iwo Jima remained, silent, unchanging. In 1968, the island was returned to Japan. At the handover ceremony, American Marines stood beside Japanese officers, saluting the same flagpole that had once divided them. The air was heavy, not with hatred, but with reverence. The island had seen too much to belong to victory or defeat alone. Today, each year on its black beaches, American and Japanese veterans gather side by side. They bow their heads. They remember. The surf carries their prayers out to sea, mingling with the wind that once carried gunfire. The island remembers them all, the brave, the lost, the unseen. It remembers the moment the flag rose, and the countless moments of silence that followed. Because on Iwo Jima, there were no victors. Only men, young, mortal, and forever bound to a patch of earth that will never forget. Time moved on. The war ended. Nations rebuilt. Yet for those who had lived through Iwo Jima, the echoes never faded. They lingered in dreams, in the smell of smoke, in the sudden silence that could pull a man back to that island of fire and stone. For the survivors, memory became both a duty and a burden. They carried the weight of comrades lost, names whispered in darkness, faces frozen in the ash of time. Many returned to quiet lives, teaching, farming, working in factories, raising families. But in still moments, their minds drifted back to the black sands. The 3 surviving flag raisers, John Bradley, Renee Gagnon, and Ira Hayes, returned home not to peace, but to the spotlight of national heroism. They were instantly transformed from ordinary soldiers into living symbols. The 7th War Bond tour that followed raised hundreds of millions of dollars, but the price was heavy. Each man bore the emotional toll differently. Renee Gagnon, suddenly famous, tried to live up to the image America had created for him, confident, victorious, unbreakable. But once the applause faded, he found himself discarded. Jobs were scarce, fame meant little, and the distance between who he was and what people expected of him became unbearable. The hero in the photograph was immortal, the man behind it was forgotten. John Bradley, the Navy corpsman, took a different path. He withdrew completely, refusing to glorify what he had seen. He built a quiet life as a funeral director, serving his community in silence. His son, James, would one day ask about Iwo Jima. John's answer was simple and final: the real heroes are the ones who didn't come back. That silence became the foundation of his son's later book, Flags of Our Fathers, which uncovered the truth behind the photograph, the courage, the trauma, and the price of myth. But it was Ira Hayes who carried the deepest scars. Haunted by what he had seen and by the false identifications in the famous photo, he fought tirelessly to restore his friend Harlan Block's rightful place in history. When the Marine Corps finally corrected the record, it came too late to heal him. The Bond tour had amplified his pain, not his pride. Even at home on the Gila River Reservation, fame brought him no peace. He turned to alcohol to silence the ghosts that never stopped calling his name. In 1955, at only 32, Ira Hayes died alone, a war hero who could not survive the peace. Their stories revealed a truth the nation had long ignored, that the heroes who raised the flag also bore its heaviest burden. The photograph had become legend, a symbol of unity, sacrifice, and triumph. Yet legends simplify. They strip away the pain, the doubt, the humanity. The flag on Suribachi was not just a banner of victory, it was a reminder of what war destroys. Across the Pacific, Japan remembered too. Families still searched for remains buried under volcanic stone. Monks prayed for the souls of those who had no graves. In Tokyo, the letters of General Kuribayashi were preserved, quiet confessions of honor, duty, and inevitable loss. Half a century later, filmmakers and historians returned to Iwo Jima's story, not to glorify it but to understand it. Clint Eastwood's twin films, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, told the story from both sides of the battlefield, a rare act of empathy that reminded the world that courage is not bound by nation and that grief knows no flag. When surviving veterans revisited Iwo Jima in their old age, they found an island transformed. The guns were gone. The air smelled of salt and rain. Birds had returned. Grass grew where bodies once fell. Standing atop Mount Suribachi, some saluted. Others wept. The wind that once carried gunfire now carried silence, a silence heavy with memory. The world remembered Iwo Jima as a victory. But for those who were there, it was something deeper. A place where humanity's best and worst stood side by side, where courage and suffering became indistinguishable. The echoes of memory remind us that war never truly ends. It endures in the hearts of those who remember, and in the quiet spaces between the words freedom and sacrifice. Decades have passed since that February morning when 6 young Marines raised a flag on Mount Suribachi. The war they fought is now history, its veterans mostly gone, its battles studied in books, its images etched into stone. Yet the flag they lifted still waves, not just in memory, but in meaning. That photograph, Joe Rosenthal's immortal frame, did more than capture a moment. It shaped how America saw the war and how the world saw America. 6 men, their faces hidden, straining together against the wind. No single hero, no central figure, only unity, effort, and purpose. It was accidental composition turned divine symbolism, a tableau of endurance born from chaos. In its anonymity lay its power. They stood not for themselves, but for every fighting Marine on that island of fire and stone. The image spread across the nation in hours. It became a postage stamp, a poster for the war bond drive, a rallying cry that raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And 10 years later, it became bronze, the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. Dedicated in 1954, the 78-foot monument cast those 6 men in eternal struggle, the flag forever reaching skyward. At dawn, the rising sun stretches their shadows across the grass. Tourists stand in silence, veterans linger longer. They see not statues, but brothers. They hear not quiet, but the echo of remembered thunder. The memorial is both triumph and tomb. It celebrates victory, but it also mourns the 6,821 Americans who died taking Iwo Jima, the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. Every inch of that bronze, every curve of straining muscle, carries the unseen weight of those buried beneath the black sands. The flag rising above Suribachi was not the end of the fight. It was the beginning of remembrance. Over the decades, historians and the Marine Corps continued to correct the record, uncovering, even in recent years, the true identities of the men immortalized in the frame. These revisions, though small in detail, are vast in meaning. They affirm that remembrance must be rooted in truth, that even icons must bow to the humanity beneath them. The pursuit of accuracy became its own act of honor, a final salute to those whose names history had misplaced. For America, the Iwo Jima flag became a mirror, reflecting both ideals and contradictions. It stood for courage and unity, but also for myth and misunderstanding. It simplified a war that was anything but simple. Yet in that simplicity lay something profound: hope. The photograph offered a nation, weary of death, a vision of endurance. It told them that amid horror, meaning could still be found. The story of the flag is, ultimately, the story of human resilience. The men who raised it were not legends in that moment. They were exhausted, frightened, and bleeding. But together they acted, without thought of history or glory. That unplanned, unpretentious act is what gives the image its eternal power. It speaks across generations. Courage is not born from perfection, but from necessity. In classrooms and museums, the photograph continues to speak. Teachers tell students that heroism is not fame, it's the quiet strength of those who endure. The story of the flag raisers reminds the young that history is made not by the mighty, but by the ordinary who act when it matters most. The legacy of Iwo Jima also belongs to Japan. Today, American and Japanese soldiers stand side by side on that same soil, once a battlefield, now a place of remembrance. Their flags rise together in the Pacific wind, symbols not of conquest, but of reconciliation. The island that once divided two nations now unites them in silence. And still, Mount Suribachi remains. Scarred but steadfast, it rises above the sea, the same sea that carried ships to war and now carries peace. Those who climb it often leave behind tokens, dog tags, photographs, handwritten notes. The wind scatters them like prayers. Somewhere beneath that soil lie the men who once looked up at the flag and found, for a fleeting moment, hope in the midst of hell. What endures is not the battle, but what it revealed: the depth of human endurance, the fragility of life, and the power of symbols to outlive their makers. The flag raised on Iwo Jima is no longer just an emblem of one war. It has become part of the human story, a promise whispered through time, that the sacrifices of the few will never be forgotten by the many. The years have turned to decades. The men are gone now, their voices quiet, their medals tarnished, their faces fading from photographs yellowed with age. Yet the image remains. 6 figures on a hill of ash, reaching upward together, the flag leaning into the wind. It endures because it is more than a picture. It is a prayer, whispered by a generation that knew the cost of peace. The flag on Iwo Jima did not rise in triumph alone. It rose in grief, in exhaustion, in the stubborn defiance of men who refused to surrender to despair. When we look upon it today, we see not only victory, but consequence. Behind every inch of that climb lay the bodies of friends, the weight of orders, and the fire of war. The men who raised it did so not for glory, but because someone had to. And that is the essence of courage: to act when there is no choice, to hope when there is no reason to. The final shots on Iwo Jima were fired not by men, but by the closing of history itself. When the island was declared secured on March 26, 1945, its black sands held more than the dead. They held a nation's grief. Nearly 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Almost 20,000 Japanese defenders died in place. The island became a graveyard of resolve. Yet from that crucible of fire, an image of enduring light emerged. Joe Rosenthal's photograph, taken on the 5th day of the battle, achieved what no speech, no headline, no victory parade ever could. It captured the will to persevere when everything seemed lost. It became a symbol of the collective strength that flickers within human despair. 6 ordinary men, bound not by destiny, but by necessity. The photograph shaped the American memory of the war, but its true legacy is moral, not martial. It reminds us that heroism is not clean, and that triumph is often shadowed by tragedy. It celebrates courage, but it also mourns the cost of it. The myth it inspired brought comfort to millions, Yet it left some of its own heroes, like Ira Hayes, lost beneath its weight. His struggle, his silence, his fall, are reminders that the burden of symbols can crush the souls they're meant to honor. Today, Iwo Jima remains sacred ground. Its tunnels are silent, its cliffs reclaimed by nature, but the earth still breathes with memory. Americans and Japanese alike come to bow their heads, not in division, but in shared reverence. The island is no longer a battlefield. It is a promise kept in stone and sand, that such sacrifice will not be forgotten. And the image, that immortal frame, has transcended its origin. It no longer belongs solely to one nation or one war. It has become a reflection of the human condition itself, the unending climb toward meaning amid destruction, the fragile yet unbreakable instinct to lift something higher than ourselves. Mount Suribachi still stands against the endless sea, the flag still waves above the graves of two nations' sons. Its shadow stretches across time, whispering that war may define nations, but sacrifice defines humanity. We remember Iwo Jima not for the flag that rose, but for the hands that lifted it, trembling, wounded, and human. And in the silence that follows, carried by wind and memory, we hear what those men could not say. That the price of freedom is never paid once. It is carried forever, in silence, in remembrance, and in the enduring hope that, even on the darkest ground, humanity will always find the strength to rise.